In this tutorial, we'll be looking at the limp raise pots between the small blind and the big blind. Let's first take a look at preflop. The small blind is limping in with about 20% of hands. However, these hands are going to be the weaker component of the overall opening range. The small blind opens about 50% of hands, so the small blind limping range is towards the bottom of that opening range. Of course, the small blind's limping range is quite well protected by the stronger hands that will limp raise and limp call. So let's first take a look at the limp and now the big blind's response to the limp. The big blind needs to respond fairly aggressively against the limp to deny equity from the small blind. The big blind will be raising at around 36% and will be raising a fairly polar range. If you consider the value component being most of these suited broadways and bigger offsuit hands and these suited connectors and suited gaps, as well as the ace-x suited, if you consider that to be the value component or semi-bluff component, you end up with a relatively polar bluffing range with a lot of these offsuit junk hands and some of the suited junk hands. This polar range will be affecting the post-flop strategy for both players. Let's take a look at the 3.5 big blind raise size and the response from the small blind. The small blind will respond to this raise size fairly aggressively with the re-raise. In other words, the Limp-2Bet. Many of the trapped Broadway type holdings, ace-king, ace-queen, the suited broadways, these hands will go for the limp raise, as well as some of the weaker hands as a semi-bluff. The limp raise size will be fairly large, 12, 14, 15 big blinds, a variety of different options that the small blind can use. The small blind will call the raise with many of the weaker pocket pairs, some suited ace-high and king-high type holdings, and the suited connected and suited gapped hands, as well as the stronger offsuit hands such as the offsuit broadways, all the way up to king-queen offsuit and ace-jack offsuit. Here, even ace-5 offsuit will call. Let's take a look at some of the other sizes that the big blind could go for the raise. Going a little bit smaller to this 3 big blind raise. The small blind simply calls a wider range. Many of these ace-x offsuit hands are now starting to call, and many more of the suited hands. If you notice that the raising range, the 3-bet range, is roughly the same, and you have roughly the same sizes being used. Vice versa, let's take a look at something bigger. Let's take a look at even 5 big blinds, which you might face. The raising range is very similar in terms of the value component. Ace queen plus, these big pocket pairs, 10s plus, and the suited aces, and king queen suited, king 10 suited. And once again, the sizes relatively large, sort of 15, 16, 17, even 18 big blinds. And the calling range has shrunk considerably. All right, now let's move on to post-flop. We have a few examples from the 3.5. Because the big blind's raising range is relatively polar, and the small blind will be calling with a tighter range, when the small blind hits the board fairly well, the small blind should be donking out. This is in contrast to, say, in position versus the big blind, because the big blind, being last to act, will be facing a relatively merged range from the in position player, and it often doesn't make too much sense to donk out unless there's a really good board for the big blind. Here, the small blind will have plenty of donks out of these 25 flops, checking around 85% of the time, which means they're donking around 15% of the time, and obviously donking at a much higher frequency on the stronger boards. All right, let's take a look at this Queen 8-6. Now, this Queen 8-6, if we look at the small blind's strategy, the small blind will be donking for a relatively small size, And the small size donk is most prevalent out of all the donk sizes, 25% and 50%. There's a little bit of 75% and low frequency at higher than that, but many of the donk sizes will be focused on the 25 and 50% donking size. Okay, so small blind on the Queen 8-6. Here, the small blind, if we look at the percentages, has a fair amount of top pair on these boards to the max of King Queen, a little bit of 2 pair, and some of the sets, pocket 8s and pocket 6. Small blind donks out, quarter pot. If we look at the relative range strength between the checking and the betting range, has slightly more top pair, 2 pair, and sets, but the checking range has relatively weaker holdings, many more of the weaker pairs and ace highs. So the small blind donking out like this means that the checking range is slightly weaker, and the big blind will bet into that at a higher frequency, rather than checking back many of these missed draws, missed pre-flop bluffs, and retaining that equity, trying to realize that equity. Okay, let's take a look after the small blind donk. After the small blind donk, there is a few raises out of the big blind. Here, raising for this small size 50% of the pot, and the raising range is going to be many of the stronger top pairs, King, Queen, Jack, Queen 10, and Ace, Queen, and the over pairs, pocket kings and pocket aces, of course, as well as many of these sets. Pocket aces doesn't raise quite as frequently as pocket kings, because pocket aces will protect many of these ace highs, which we'll just call this small bet. So say, for example, we get a call and a 2 on the turn, and then we face another bet. The pocket aces will now decide to raise a little bit more or call down on the river. So we get another brick. 5 isn't really a brick because it brings some straights, but either way, jamming it in, aces will fold. But going for sort of these smaller bets like quarter pot, aces will now spring the trap and go for a raise. Or if there's a check, the pocket aces will go for a relatively big bet, such as 100% of the pot or 75% of the pot. Now, in contrast, if the small blind checks, the big blind will be betting around 35% of the time. And the hands which are bet are fairly similar to the hands that are raised, except at just a higher frequency. So many of those top pairs, over pairs, 2 pairs and sets, just used at a higher frequency, because the small blind will be checking weaker holdings. The big blind can just bet at a higher frequency and not need to protect that check back range quite as often. In contrast, when facing the donking range is simply stronger, and so the big blind will need to be using some stronger hands to protect it. Now, if it checks through and we get a relative brick, the small blind will be leading out for reasonably large sizes. So here for a pot size bet, and that pot size bet contains many of the top pairs. There's not quite as many top pairs in the big blind's range, which checks back. So there's no real need for the small blind to be defending the checking range with a large number of top pairs. Small blind checks. The big blind will obviously bet most of the remainder of their top pairs, particularly the stronger ones, and over pairs and 2 pairs, in order to try to get 2 streets of value. So, for example, a pot size bet, and then some of those top pairs that the small blind did decide to check will make up a good bulk of the calling range here. Once again, 5 of hearts, check, face a pot size bet, and now these top pairs essentially snap it off against a 75%. All the top pairs snap it off. They make a fairly good bluff catcher because they overlap with the value range for the smaller size, or block the value range for the smaller sizes. Against a bigger bet, say 1.5, now many of the top pairs are pure bluff catchers on this particular run out. Let's take a look at another one. One of the higher donking frequencies for the small blind is this 8-8-2. Let's take a look at it. We have a flush draw on this board, and the flush draws are definitely going to favor the small blind, given the fact that the small blind called many of the suited hands pre-flop. So if you look at the relative frequencies, these flush draws are 9% out of the small blind and around 6.5% for the big blind. And here on this 882, there's a fair amount of trips for the small blind, around 7%, and the big blind around 6%. Obviously, there's the full houses of 2s and the quads of 8s at very low frequency, just because it's very hard to make those hands, and many of the pocket pairs. These pocket pairs tend to be betting into the big blind. In similar fashion, these ace highs are betting into the big blind. This is all to deny equity from these unmade hands down on the bottom left, these pre-flop bluffs, which will have a lot of difficulty continuing, despite the fact that the small blind is using a very small size. The big blind against a small size bet is going to be doing a fair amount of raising, here around 16% of the time. And then the small blind can go for the 3-bet once again around 16% of the time, with many of these trips or better for the value component, as well as some of these lower pocket pairs as a semi-bluff / denial raise there. Bet raise 3-bet, call. For example, we got a 5, check, face a quarter pot bet. And these pocket 4s, pocket 3s going for that double check raise some of the time, or just going for the check call. Jack, if they get jammed into, then they're mostly indifferent, or checking back, and you'll tend to win against a weaker pair or an ace high hand when you've got a hand like pocket 3s or pocket 4s. Looking at the EV of these particular hands, 9.7, 9.26. Calling this bet here on the turn, quarter pot, 10.5. You're trying to, on average, get a 10.5 big blind EV on the river. So that's the goal with kind of calling that. And obviously, if you see that in many of these boards, many of these river runouts, the EV of the pocket 4s, pocket 3s will be somewhat lowered. But obviously, if you hit a set yourself, the EV goes through the roof. Okay, let's take a look at the checking range here for the small blind. Despite the fact that there's a lot of donks, we compare the two in terms of the percentages. There's fewer 3-of-a-kinds in the checking range compared to the donking range, and similarly fewer pocket pairs and ace highs. The small blind will be checking a lot of these weaker holdings, and the big blind will be betting into that a fair amount of the time, almost 50% of the time, and betting this half pot. So half pot, many of these weak hands just folded out. Many of the king highs will be calling, or the ace highs will be calling, and then all these pocket pairs can go for some denial check raise, protected by the 3-of-a-kind. If you get a in position raise, many of these pocket pairs will fold out, and then 3-of-a-kind will simply continue. It doesn't make too much sense to raise again in position after they check raise on the flop on such a dry board. Even though there's a flush draw, you're going to run into trips a lot of the time. So for example here, and you face an all-in, your flush draws aren't really loving that particular spot. The all-in isn't going to happen too frequently because this raise size here, which happens 1% of the time, is very polar. So after the check raise, and you get a 5, a lot of the trips or better just keep blasting for the pot size bet. And then if the big blind just calls down, a lot of the trips and full houses just rip it in, for the remainder 70%. All the trips will check, and they face an all-in, the trips will just snap it off alongside some of the top pairs. Okay, let's have a look at one more board, one that's less good for the small blind, and so won't be donked quite as often. Say, for example, 665. In contrast to the 882, this 665 doesn't quite have as many 3-of-a-kinds in the small blinds range as it does in the big blinds range. If you look at the 6x holdings, very many of these 6x hands went for a pre-flop raise as a bluff or semi-bluff. The 6x hands do fairly well against the ace highs that go for the call out of the small blind, insofar as the run out 2, 3, 4, 5 ends up favoring the 6 rather than the ace. And so you get a little bit of cooler potential there. And also the 6 makes a fair amount of straights all the way up to the 10, all the way down to the 2. So that one card does fairly well. So on a 6-6 board, there's going to be a lot of trips for the big blind relative to the small blind. So here 7% for the big blind and only 4.3% for the small blind. Additionally, of course, the big blind has a good chunk of overpairs to the 5. The big blind also has many 5x holdings for similar reasons to the 6x. Those 5x hands can make a fair amount of straights up the top and the bottom. And a hand like King 6 or King 5, Queen 6 or Queen 5, when there is a 5 or a 6 on the board, will dominate many of the calling hands out of the small blind, namely these suited, connected and suited gap hands. A little bit of domination there, which works pretty well for the big blind as a semi-bluff. Check and say, for example, a half pot bet. Many of the overcard holdings and many of these ace highs simply have to fold. And now there's a 15% raising frequency. You notice in all of these flops that we looked at, there's a reasonable raising frequency of around 15%. That theme is fairly prevalent. Check, small bet, raising around 15% on average. Of course, different boards raise different frequencies and different bet size. Against a bigger bet size of 3.5, you'll be going for the check raise slightly less often. So there you've got around 10% against the 3.5 size out of the big blind. So here on this particular board, these paired boards, you're raising a little bit more because these pocket pairs and these ace highs do need to deny some equity from overcard type holdings. So a hand like ace jack is going to be ahead a good chunk of the time against those bluffs, and so you want to deny equity, either getting those bluffs to fold or getting a hand like king high to call, or a weaker ace high to call. So a little bit of value there, but obviously it is a semi-bluff drawing against the bigger pocket pairs and basically any pair. So going for the raise, if you do hit your ace, this ace jack works really well as a bluff catcher now. Check, face half pot bet, ace jack is going to happily call, get a relative brick 2 on the river, check, and now if you face the all in, you've got a pure bluff catcher with your ace jack, or against a 3/4 pot bet, here your ace jack is once again a bluff catcher, sometimes being used as a bluff jam, ripping it in, getting the opponent's top pairs to fold, particularly those stronger top pairs, ace king, ace queen. Okay. Against the half pot bet, the ace jack just snaps it off, and weaker top pairs go for that check raise bluff, jam it in. These top pairs will be indifferent. So we've had a bit of a look at some of these flops in the limp raise spot out of the small blind and big blind. The main things to notice is that the small blind does donk a fair amount. The small blind will be having a good equity lead on many of these flops. The higher the equity lead, the more aggressive in general, the more aggressive the small blind can be at donking out. And the lower the equity in general, the less frequently the small blind will be donking. Of course, that doesn't always apply, but as a general rule, if you can estimate the equity between the two ranges, if you've got an equity lead out of the small blind, don't be afraid to donk. Of course, high card hands, such as the king or the ace, you're going to be donking fairly less often. Let's take a look at the ace 3-3 and see why the small blind isn't donking at all, despite having the equity lead. If you look at it, the small blind has the equity lead simply because many of these made hands are stronger than the made hands in the big blind's range. If you look at all of these unmade hands, such as the queen highs, king highs, jack highs, they're simply stronger on average than the big blind. So if we go back here and look at the overall betting range out of the big blind is betting very often. A lot of these pocket pairs and top pairs just betting for a small size, quarter pot or half pot, and effectively denying a lot of equity from these queen high holdings, suited connected hands, which simply cannot continue. And on this ace 3-3 board being so dry, the small blind needs to continue with essentially all of their king highs and some of their queen highs. All the weaker pairs will continue. Essentially all the pocket pairs will be continuing, and obviously an ace high will snap off this bet. So in that sense, many of these weaker holdings out of the big blind, which bluffed pre-flop, can go for a high frequency bluff here on the flop, and then have a good drawing chance against the king highs, which call out of the small blind. So a hand like 10-4, 10-5, Jack-6, Jack-7, they will draw reasonably well against the king high and the queen high in the small blind's calling range. So say for example half pot, and you do get that 10 on the turn, small blind checks again, and then these 10 high hands making middle pair will happily check it back, get a relative brick on the river, and then facing one of these small bets, these 10x holdings will happily snap it off, and against a bigger bet, half pot, these 10 high holdings will, these pair of 10 holdings will snap it off. And against a larger bet, such as twice the pot, they're suddenly indifferent. These 2x pot bets, mainly coming out of the stronger top pairs, the top pairs with a very strong kicker. Not necessarily a super strong kicker, but many of these top pairs nevertheless will be going for a 2x pot bet. Simply, this checking range on the turn doesn't have a lot of these top pairs. Many of the top pairs from the big blind's preflop range will be these ace king, ace queen, ace 10 holdings, which will just simply bet the turn here to go for a lot of value. Here going for a 2x pot over bet, call, check, jam it in with those same holdings as ace 10, two pair, and ace queen, ace king, ripping it in, and these top pairs will essentially be indifferent. Checking, and then it checks through on the river. These top pairs themselves, such as the ace jack, ace 5 holdings, can go for an overbet for 2x the pot, because you would expect many of the stronger top pairs to simply have bet the turn once again for 2x the pot, and you would have called. You're going to end up losing roughly the same amount if the opponent checked back a hand like ace king or ace queen or even ace jack. When you've got a hand like ace 9 or ace 5 going for this 2x pot bet, you're going to get called by many of these bluff catchers here on the river. Pot size bet, similarly, you're going to get called by a lot of those bluff catchers with a 10 on the river. You shouldn't worry too much about the top pair holdings, because if you look at the big blind's check back range, then you get a brick 2 here. There is simply less than 10% top pair plus. And if you're looking at 2 pair or better, or ace jack, I should say, or better, then that's less than 5% of the range, and the raising range is less than 5%. So going for a 2x pot bet, you're going to be fairly happy that you are actually getting value with a hand as low as ace 5 or ace 6. So that's what happens when you go for a check call and then it checks through on the turn. Don't be afraid to go for an overbet yourself, because in these polar ranges, the big blind will simply bet very polar on the turn. And if you're going to snap call these turn bets yourself, and like ace 5, ace 7, ace jack, which should be calling at a very high frequency, you end up roughly losing the same amount if your opponent checks back and you get a brick. Similarly, like a queen, for example, pot size bet, you can quite happily go with basically every top pair. 7, similarly, pot size bet, you can go with essentially any top pair. So don't be afraid to go for really big bets when you have top pair after a small bet on the turn and then checks through on the river. Okay, so we looked at 4 boards, and we looked at a variety of different strategies that the small blind can take to defend against the big blind's aggression. And we also looked at some of the donking lines out of the small blind, namely on the boards that are going to be fairly good for the small blind's range. And in general, the small blind has a equity lead. So that's the end of this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed. We'll see you in the next one.